Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. It is just such an incredible joy to see all of your faces here. This has been, as all of you know, a very long time in the planning and the making. On behalf of Su Ming and both of our families and the whole Chou family, extended Chou family, welcome to all of you. Thank you for braving St. Patrick's Day and everything else, Friday afternoon traffic. I do think the luck will be with us today, but we really appreciate all of you being here for this memorial and centennial celebration for Dad. As all of you know, Dad passed away at the age of 96 in October of 2019 on the eve of a global pandemic. And so we never, as a family, had an opportunity to commemorate his life amongst ourselves, let alone to really do justice to his incredible work and his legacy and his love and partnership with so many of you here in this room. So, again, on behalf of all of us in the Chou family, we're just so happy to be able to finally do this and have you all here in person after a couple of years, very long years, where this was obviously very, very challenging. I just wanted to mention that this is being live streamed right now. We have a number of family, friends, colleagues around the world, across the United States, but also particularly in China, who are not able to be here tonight. I know at last count we had something like 16 or 20 already on, so please know this is being streamed. We'll record the proceedings as well, and we will make sure that we keep that as a historical record going forward. So let me turn it over to my brother Su Ming.
Sure. And before we begin with the festivities, just want to send a huge thank you to everyone that's helped put this together. Susan Rhodes, Dad's longtime colleague at the U.S.-China Arts Exchange, who led the planning of tonight's event. Belinda Guan, Dad's amazing assistant, who's really been with us every step of the way through so many years planning and being involved in so many complex activities. Michelle Vosper, Dad's co-conspirator during the early years of the center, and of course Professor Li Yang from UCSD, both of whom have spent the last several months helping us plan this event as well. The program tonight is intended to give us all a perspective on the many dimensions of Dad's life and legacy. Elena and Bailey will offer their perspective as grandchildren, and Espen, my son, will conclude the event with the playing of the gong, which we will explain in more detail later in the program. We're honored to have Professor Fred Laerdal here tonight. Fred succeeded Dad as the Fritz Reiner Professor of Musical Composition here at Columbia. By the way, we are also honored to have Professor Marcos Balter here, who is the most recent recipient of the Fritz Reiner Professorship. Professor Laerdal will speak about Dad's legacy as a composer and an academic here at the university.
And I think it's important also to say that in putting a program like this together, it could have been a marathon 5-day of lecture series, and so we had to be very disciplined about who we asked to present, and everyone was selected not because they're the most important or anything like that. It really because each person speaking represents a different aspect of Dad's life, both as a professional but also as a family man. So we wanted to give all of you all the different dimensions of who Dad was to us as a father, but also to all of us here as an important contributor to the arts. So in addition to Elena and Bailey and Professor Laerdal, we're really honored to have Professor Chinri Ung here tonight in person, and Susan as well. Thank you very much for being here. And Chinri is this really representing Dad's legacy as a teacher. And I think for Suming and me, our earliest memories of anyone that we thought of as Dad's student was Chinnery, even though Chinnery now is an incredibly celebrated, world-famous musician of his own. We always continued to think of him as his earliest Asian student. And really that relationship set the standard and the tone for Dad's relationship with students through the many, many decades that he taught. So we're really honored that he's here from San Diego. And more importantly, I think for us as kids growing up, we didn't know anything about Chinnery's incredible accomplishments as a composer or musician. We were flabbergasted by his abilities to catch fireflies at Yaddo in the summer and to put them in a jar, which we would run back home with and put on a shelf. And of course, they'd stop shining as soon as we got them home, and ask Chinnery to catch some more for us. We were stunned by his ability to catch fish at Yaddo with a safety pin and a piece of tuna fish on it when no one else with all their fancy equipment could catch anything. So Chinnery was a bit of a mystical figure for Suming and me growing up. That's not what he's speaking about tonight, but that's what he represents to us. Susan Rhodes, who Suming mentioned, will talk about the important legacy of the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange. So many of you here know Dad as a composer, but really the work that he did in advancing the understanding of the cultural intersections and the importance of cultural synergies between the U.S. and China from an artistic and cultural standpoint is as important as any of the work he did as a composer. So Susan will be talking about that work and about how that's being carried forward. But I also want to mention in particular, Suming mentioned Michelle's ongoing partnership. Michelle was Dad's first partner at the center, and she's been reunited with the family in recent years to help us to really take the legacy of Dad's work between the U.S. and China forward. And then also we have Jerry Edelman here and many other folks from the center who I want to acknowledge. But Jerry also has been a key partner in this, not only originally in the center's work with the Yunnan and the minority tribes in the Yunnan province, but also continues to work with us on the Spiralis Music Trust, which is how we've carried Dad's work forward as a family in honor of his legacy. The Spiralis Trust has had the pleasure of working very closely with Professor Jim Chung from here at Columbia University. Jim runs the beautiful CV Star East Asian Library here on the campus. He is here with his colleague Evian Pan, who's going to talk, the two of them, about the incredible work that they are doing in collaboration with the Spiralis Music Trust to archive the work that the U.S.-China Arts Exchange did over the years. So we're really super excited about that partnership and excited to hear about the work that they are doing today.
Professor Lei Liang will speak about Dad's collaboration with the Shanghai Conservatory in Guangzhou, China, where the impact of Dad's legacy has grown exponentially in recent years. And we'll also hear a video from President Tsai Qiaozong, the president of Shanghai, about the My Dad's Center at the conservatory. And finally, we'll hear a performance of the second movement from Dad's String Quartet, number 2 Streams, by the wonderful Brentano String Quartet, who are Dad's closest musical collaborators in the later years of his career.
So thank you all for being here. We hope you find this program inspiring and meaningful and not too long. We miss both Dad and Mom very, very much, but we know that they're here in spirit. They were both Chinese leprechauns in their own ways, so it's very fitting that we're doing this on St. Patrick's Days. With that, let us turn the proceedings over to Elena and Bailey.
I think that we also just wanted to say thank you, everyone, again, for coming together in celebration of our Yaya's great life and 100th birthday. I feel as if ever since the pandemic, and my dad brought up also in coinciding with the passing of our Yaya, I've had less time to think about my past. I don't know if anyone else has kind of felt that life has gotten a little faster as the pandemic took over. So it's actually been very nice to take a second and think back and reflect on some of the moments that we've had with Yaya as our grandfather. One memory that stands out is from when I was no more than 6 or 7 years old, up in Rhinebeck, New York. The house in Rhinebeck is one that exists as a remembrance of simpler times, no technology, nothing to distract you from having deep conversations with one another. Those conversations that were driven by curiosity, wonder, things that I feel like you find a little less now. And no conversation was quite as meaningful to me as the ones that I had with Yaya up in Rhinebeck.
Many of my most cherished moments and memories of Yaya revolve around Rhinebeck, too. The earliest of those may be the Christmas morning that he dressed up as Santa Claus himself. And I must have been all of 2 or 3 years old, and let's just say that Yaya's surprise didn't quite have the intended effects. And despite his cheeky grin and all of his ho-ho-hos, I was terrified of this mysterious man who was wearing the most bizarre getup I'd ever seen, and I burst out into tears. Yaya was a master of mischief, and that trait traced back to his own childhood. I remember so many tales of pranks that he and his siblings would play on their poor, unassuming butler. Think antics that were straight out of a Home Alone movie. There were other stories, too. Stories of his escape across China during wartime, of his arrival in the States. We'd talk about the importance of doing something with your life that contributes positively to the world, and about his own process of figuring out exactly what that for him would be. You can imagine the impact that conversations like that left on my own adolescent mind.
Conversations with Yaya were the types of conversations where you would end up with a very dry throat running downstairs for a glass of water. The only other place that I've had quite that same type of feel was actually at my Camp Beckett. At Beckett, no one has any technology there as well. It fostered very deep, meaningful connections, again, built on conversation, learning, understanding one another. And the best part of a day at Camp Beckett was culminated with something called cabin chat, where the whole cabin would get together and a counselor would ask a question. And one question that was asked repeatedly year over year that I was there was, if you could have dinner with one person in history, who would it be? When I was younger, it was always Eli Manning. I wanted to talk with the person that I wanted to be on the big screen. And I reflected on that question again once Yaya passed, because I realized that something that I had taken for granted, very much so, was the importance of those conversations on my life. I was too young to realize, but the perspective that he had on the world from the things that Lena talked about, such as coming over from China, deep philosophies that, again, sitting for hours when I was 6 or 7, just talking. It's some of the greatest impacts on my own worldview today. And I hope that many of you can resonate in some way with that sentiment about what Yaya was able to do for me, at least.
For all of his accomplishments and profound contributions to music, culture, and society, as Chou Wen-chung, to us in our family, he was first and foremost Yaya. He was the leader of perhaps the greatest dinner table conversations of all time, the bestower of infinite wisdom, and those were gifts that we as his grandkids were privy to in a way that I think I too took for granted at the time. But he was also the grandfather who took his grandson by the hand to catch his first trout in the pond at the bottom of the driveway in Rhinebeck. And he was the grandfather who helped fill the gardens of 188 Sullivan Street with Easter eggs for his toddler grandkid. And he was the man who'd spend days cooking up a feast of steaming clay pot braises, delicate dumplings, crisp tender greens studded with ginger, none of which could be done without numerous screams of, "Ah, yeah, it's ruined."
These are just a few of our many memories of our Yaya. However you knew him, whether it be through his works, his passion for the exchange of music and cultures, his time here at Columbia, or a 6-course meal at the dining table with him, we are sure that he challenged the ways in which you thought about this world. So in honor of that and in honor of Yaya, keep challenging yourself and others, Don't be daunted by an unobtainable perfection. Cherish it. Embrace the beauty of it. That's what he would have wanted.
Thank you all again for being with us here today to celebrate our grandfather. We hope that this reflection and the ones to follow will allow us all to honor the many roles that he played, the people he touched, the impact he had, and the incredible person that he was. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Fred Laerdal. I was the second Reiner professor, I'm going to talk a little bit about Chou Wen-chung's role as a professor at Columbia, and a little bit more about him as a composer. He joined the faculty in the 1950s. He helped found the Doctoral of Musical Arts in the 1960s, and ran the doctoral composition program for decades. He was very punctilious about procedures and standards, and as a teacher, he was very attentive to detail, and you had to notate things just right. And if you were writing for percussion, you had to find just the right stick to hit the drum, and there would be long conversations about what the sound was like and so on. All these details mattered a great deal to him. There was a bench outside his office, and twice a year, students would be waiting for their semi-annual report when their fate would be determined. At least that's how they felt it was. And so these people would be waiting nervously, and then somebody would be called in, and they'd come back, and it was all very formal and very serious. It was, to me, as a younger Columbia professor, it was all very funny. So then when he established the Doctor of Musical Arts, that also was the founding of the School of the Arts, which originally was motivated by the fact that the School of the Doctor of Musical Arts needed an institutional home. So they founded the School of the Arts. Eventually, the School of the Arts encompassed all the other arts, and eventually the music part of it left the School of the Arts. But he did that, and he became vice chair of the School of the Arts for many years, played a very important role in its development. So you could see that he was extremely involved administratively. Of course, he founded the U.S.-China Arts Exchange, and he brought, in the 1980s, he brought the creme de la creme of young Chinese composers to America, and very rich cultural exchange between composition in China and the United States, which reverberates today. So I would say that, and then when he retired in the 1980s, I became Reiner professor in the 1990s, but I inherited everything that he had done as the School of the Arts, the Doctor of Musical Arts, the doctoral program, the standards that he set, the procedures that happened. So I felt that I was standing on his shoulders, and I've always been extremely grateful and aware that how much I owed to him and my colleagues as well. So now let me say a few words about him as a composer. I'll say, first of all, personally, that I first met him in 1975 at my first visit to Columbia. I was giving a talk on my music, and from the back room came a very penetrating question from Professor Chou about the principles of musical organization regarding something about rhythm. I needn't go into the details, but I gave an answer that he liked, because it was I wasn't accepting what everybody else was believing at that time, and I gave reasons for it. And that's the way he was. He always wanted reasons for things, and he was interested in basic principles, and he liked not being a normal standard person, but doing something, going your own way. That was very important to him, and something that I have always shared with him. So we became good friends over the years, and he was always such a gracious person in my experience. The most important musical influence on him as a composer was, of course, the great avant-garde composer Edgar Varèse. He became Varèse's assistant in the 1950s, helped Varèse finish his last works, including Des Airs, which is one of his greatest pieces. His role, Chou Wen-chung's role, just in that capacity alone would make him an important person. And of course, he's looked after all the sketches and archives of Varèse ever since. Varèse taught him his dedication to hard work and to pursuing an integrated, uncompromising aesthetic. If Wen-chung had been weaker, he would have tried to imitate Varèse, but he didn't at all. His personality was completely different, and he found his own way with sort of an attitude toward music and art, but he did it entirely in his own way. There are various stories. He loved to tell stories about Varèse. I suspect that's the gong but there's a story about a gong which I'll relate very briefly, which is that this was in the doorway to the music study where he lived, and he hit the gong for me, and I said, "What a beautiful sound!" And you hit it, and then the overtones come flying up into the stratosphere, and so evidently he said that when Varèse was on a trip, when he came home, first he had to strike the gong, and only then would he kiss his wife. There are many others. There are many other stories about Varèse. Varèse was extremely critical and had a rather foul language a lot of the time when he spoke. So I would get these unadulterated descriptions, which I will not repeat. But I think the main point from Varèse that he got from Varèse is that composing is hard, and if you want to do it really well, you have to really work hard, and much is demanded of you, and you must go your own way and seek perfection. He would relate all these stories about Varèse with he would throw his hands up like this and with a great big smile and a big belly laugh, and it was just full of charm, and just loved telling these stories. Now about his own music, just a few words. He rejected superficial references to Chinese music, but he sought to integrate principles of Chinese music and culture with Western developments. He developed his own theory of melodic modes, partly in relation to Chinese pitch structures, but also in relation to Western scales and set theory, modern set theory in America. He pursued in his music asymmetries and symmetries, which are very audible in his music. He sort of the yin and yang of balance and imbalance. He told me that he worked with hexagrams from the I Ching. He never explained to me how. I know he also did a lot of calligraphy, and that also influenced him, again, in ways that he never explained. Like many composers, he didn't go into detail about his working methods very much, but his music was very organized, and it always achieved an exquisite balance and refinement. I would say his music was an act of contemplation. Finally, let me just say that during all those years when he was so busy as an administrator, he went through a period when he composed very little, and this was extremely difficult for him. And often I thought he was very frustrated and in some ways unhappy and more withdrawn. So it was especially wonderful after he retired that he really had a resurgence of creativity and wrote much of his best music, string quartets, chamber music, percussion music, well into his 80s, I think even into his 90s. And it was such a wonderful thing to see, and it brought such joy to him, and of course the music itself brings joy to all of us.
I'm Chin Ryu. I'm currently teaching at the University of California, San Diego. I first met Chou Wen-chung in the fall of 1965 following a concert of his music. I became his student sometime later and remained very close to Chou over many decades. The committee had asked me to say a few words about my view on Chou's teaching and guidance. Here it is. During my formative years in music composition, I first studied privately with Chou Wen-chung for a couple of years in the mid-60s, and then formally at Columbia University in the 70s. I recall reading an interview in which Chou said, composition cannot be taught, but the way he did teach was admirable. During in a one-on-one lesson, Chou would often point to spot in my sketches, then look at me, smile, and begin to make comments. Whatever transpired, Chou consistently stayed away from offering me any solution. I believe perhaps he wanted me to think it over. Edgar Varese, in his own mentor, preferred to pencil in on X as a marker on Chou's sketch for Chou to think it over as well. In the bigger picture, Chou didn't teach me any specific musical ideology or any one compositional system or any particular school of thought. In other words, there was no set rule that I was aware of in a positive sense. Furthermore, such practice somehow influenced my teaching for decades. This approach coincides with Chou's words when I conducted a 4-day interview at his residence about a decade ago. This is what he said. Well, I feel that every composer, no matter how young or advanced, will have to understand that there should not be a real model for you. His advice on this matter did come from a precedent set when the younger Chou was about to be sent off to take lessons with Edgar Varese. Colin McVeigh told Chou, well, your teacher is going to be Edgar Varese, but I am not going to recommend you to him unless you promise me you are not going to influence by him or be overwhelmed by him. Just to offer another account, in the early 70s, I presented an opening sketch of my new chamber ensemble piece to Chou. The piece began a similar fashion as Chou's duet for flute and piano entitled Cursive. Regretfully, it turned out to be an adaptation of Chou's style similar to his Cursive. Chou, take a look. There was a long silence. A few minutes later, he said, this isn't you. What this lesson taught me was to have a courage to stand on my own feet. In retrospect, until today, this has allowed me to take a journey, a road toward artistic liberation and on equal footing on one's own search for inner voices. A major turning point for me, both as a composer and a young teacher, came from a rather deep conversation I had a heart-to-heart where we each recounted some stories. It was so dramatic and unforgettable to this day. Following a concert organized by the Asian Cultural League Conference Festival, we sat in a hotel lounge in Seoul, Korea in the late 1970s. At one point, Chou spoke of his deepest regret while visiting his father for the last time and knowing that it was about to be his father's last moments. Somehow, Chou left the room without giving his father a goodbye hug. The memory caused him deep sorrow. We were both speechless for some minutes. My turn came and I recounted a recent story I had while in residence at Northern Illinois University. The time period coincided with the reign of the Khmer Rouge genocidal regime in Cambodia. In the dream, a text written by an unknown person decrying the unfairness leading to a major collapse and suffering of the people and the upheaval that occurred during the genocidal era. I shared this vivid dream to Chou. At last, he said, "This dream was yours, does need a symphony." 6 years later, in 1986, I composed In the Voices, and it was premiered by the Philadelphia Orchestra. Here, Chou's creative impulse was spontaneous, as if to say that some of life experiences can find their way into art form. I end up dedicated In the Voices to Chou, whose guidance had been priceless. I would like to leave this brief address and recount one of our conversations, humbly just to show that Chou was not only full of wisdom and other serious quality, but he was also at times quite entertaining and even joyful. This phone conversation followed after my teaching very first undergraduate composition seminar. I told Chou that I gave a rather unusual homework assignment to my student. It was week one of the seminar of young composer at University of California, San Diego. During our phone call, I could tell that Chou was awaiting to hear the news. When a student asked me about the nature of the assignment the next week, I said, it's simple. Each student should bring music of any kind and share it in the class. This music should be what you would like to listen to with your own headphones on your deathbed. When I was finished telling story, Chou immediately broke out in laughter and was full of joy. Then he said in response to my deathbed assignment, said, "Chinnery, I have one. It is my string quartet number 2 stream." I am deaf and humble and extremely fortunate to be one of the earlier students of Chou Wen-chung in the 60s. Also, I am so grateful for a friendship that we had for over half a century. Susan, my wife, and I are honored to be here celebrating Chou Centennial Memorial. Thank you.
Hard acts to follow. My name is Susan Rhodes. You've already heard my name a couple of times today. I'm lucky enough to be addressing you because I was the assistant director and then associate director of the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange for 12 years. So I set the record. But I had Michelle Vosper, who's here today, as having set the high mark for that position. And also Ken Howe, I don't think he's here. He thought he was going to be here, but who interpreted for us for decades on both sides of the Pacific. Without who's interpreting, I don't know how we ever would have managed. Anyway, I'm fortunate to be here and be with all of you. As Luyan and Sumin said, this has been a long time in the making. I don't have any yeah stories, but I was caught in an earthquake with Chou Wen-chung. Of course, we never called him, we called him Professor Joe on this side of the campus. But we managed, we got out of the earthquake, was 35 kilometers from where we were. We were near Pu'er. We were driving from Kunming to Xishuangbanna, several days worth of driving through the mountains. And there was an earthquake, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange, think about this, 1977. So it was 1 year after Mao Zedong's death, 1 year after the end of the Cultural Revolution. Some people are shaking their heads. 1 year after the imprisonment of the Gang of Four. And the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, represented here today, arranged a trip, a delegation to go to China and invited Chou Wen-chung to participate. 1977. So he went over, and as you've already heard, you want something done, give it to somebody busy, right? He was already too busy. But he had a dream, he had a vision, and his vision was to create an exchange program in the arts, professional exchange in the arts between the United States and China. And he had actually had this vision earlier. In 1972, he went over to arrange the funerals of his father-in-law. But it was too early then, and now, of course, in hindsight, we know the Cultural Revolution was in full swing. But in 77, the time was right. That delegation met with the Ministry of Culture. He met with the minister and with Lin Mohan, who was the Vice Minister of Culture, and they struck up an immediate rapport. And he's decided, the rest of you go home, I'm going to stay on for a little while. One thing about names, I'm going to mention a few more names. I could stand here for an hour and just say names of people who were instrumental in the success of the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange. Names in the U.S., names in China, and names elsewhere. But we don't have the time for that, and I'm sure you don't have the patience for it. Just as Leanne said, we could do a 1 week's worth of workshops. And also, when you think of 77, it was just prior to normalization of relations between the United States and China. And that's when Chou Wen-chung's vision had to turn into his persuasiveness. He had to persuade the Chinese, let's get on board with this little U.S.-China Arts Exchange Center. Then he had to come back and persuade Columbia University that this would be a good house, a good home for the center, which, of course, he did. And then he had to persuade funders to step up and fund this little NGO that could. And the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Henry Luce Foundation with a research grant came and supported us. And then, of course, over the years, we had support from the Asian Cultural Council, represented by Ralph Samuelson here today, the Albert Kunstadter Family Foundation. We are fortunate enough to have Jerry Kunstadter with us here today. We had so many dedicated funders over the years. And then he had to bring his charisma to people like Arthur Miller and E.L. Doctorow, Ed Doctorow to him, and Galway Cannell, and Seymour Topping, and Ted Solotaroff, and I.M. Pei, and Yo-Yo Ma, people who sat on our advisory council, people who brought their expertise to China under our auspices. And then Chinese who came here, Cao Yu, the playwright, who struck a great friendship with Arthur Miller, Zhu Lin, who played Linda Lohman in Death of a Salesman, Xiao Rei-ying, who played Willie Lohman. So all of these people back and forth, and one of the precepts of the center was that it wasn't that the Americans went to China to teach and the Chinese came here to learn. It was absolutely, we went there to learn as well as teach, and they came here to teach us as well as to learn. And one of the biggest examples of that was in arts education. We were fortunate enough to have the participation of Howard Gardner and his wife, Ellen Winner, who were like the premier team in arts education, to go over and spend time in China and help compare the way that arts education was conducted in China and the way arts education was conducted here. And Ji Junshi, who was head of the Ministry of, Ken Howe is with us, the Ministry of Education at that time, was part of that exchange program. And then, of course, his exchange work went beyond music. It was ballet and architecture and sculpture and painting and theater design, you name it. Ming Chua Lee was part of our advisory council. George White was very involved with us. So we were just in so many different realms. And then it was very important to Professor Zhou that we also involve classroom teachers, not just the most famous artists, but also just everyday 6th grade teachers, 7th grade teachers. So we got separate money from the O'Neill Family Foundation and sent classroom teachers to China and brought Chinese classroom teachers here. I would say the first decade of the center was mostly kind of centered in the Beijing and Shanghai along the East Coast. The Central Conservatory of Music, headed by Wu Zuqiang, whom we worked with so closely. The Shanghai Conservatory of Music, headed by Sang Tong, whom we also worked so closely with. And then after the dislocations of 1989, and also the strong interest of the Ford Foundation in working on minority cultures, we shifted our focus to Yunnan province and the national minorities. And as I said, we took that amazing drive through Yunnan. But Professor Chou took many trips before that trip and after that trip. And we had a big conference in Yunnan. But the idea was to look at how minority nationalities were represented. A museum was built in Yunnan with the help of the people who came here and met with people who were working in minority education, minority museums, in pueblos, in Washington, D.C., where they were just beginning to think about the Museum of African American Culture. So that, I would say the next decade was spent mostly concentrating on that. And then the years after I left were mostly shifted, I think, toward ecology and conservation. And there's a fabulous book on the table. We invite you to take a look, take a book, and sign up if the books are all gone, if you're interested. And that was a part of the last couple of decades of his work at the center. The center was in existence for 4 decades. Chou Wen-chung foresaw it coming to an end. I think he believed in what they call vanishing mediator, that our work would be done if there were, as there were by then, so many other avenues of exchange, university to university, sister cities, ballet company to ballet company, orchestra to orchestra. They didn't need us anymore. And I think that was one of his legacies. And we'll be fortunate to hear next from Jim Chung and Ispan, the archivist, of how the center's legacy will live on in the C.V. Starr East Asian Library at Columbia, the most fitting place for it. And also we have a website, so if you want to learn more about the center, you can consult the website. Thank you so much for your attention.
There was and will be a deep bonding between Professor Chou and the C.V. Starr East Asian Library at Columbia. Once Professor Chou wrote in the article, as an artist, I find the ancient Chinese tradition of Wenren, man of the arts, irresistible, which had a profound impact on his professional and career and personal lives. Whenever I saw Professor Chou, he always told me, and he recalled vividly, emotionally, the time he spent in our famous Rare Book reading room in the base of the Kent Hall. And Starr East Asian Library, we owns one of the 3 top East Asian libraries in North America, including over 1,100 volumes Chinese rare books published before 1796. When I first met Professor Chou to talk about the future of the archives of the Center for the U.S.-China Arts Exchange, and he said, the center is the result of my lifelong study of Chinese culture and heritage. So after, we first met, and consequently in 2016 March, the first time we met in the January 18, then in the March 2016, Professor Chou signed the deed of gifts, generously donated the center of the U.S.-China Art Exchange Archive to the Columbia, to the C.V. Starr East Asian, with over 120 boxes. And these archives arrived at a new home. And later, in January 2022, when the Professor Chou passed away, and we received the deed of gift signed by the Professor Chou's son, Ru Yan and Su Ming, to donate Professor Chou's personal papers. So this special bonding will continue. Today, with the deep gratitude to Professor Chou, I would like to report Professor Chou's family, his students, colleagues, and friends that we have fulfilled our promise to Professor Chou, that we have completed the process of the center's archive and make it accessible to the faculty, students, and his students and the scholars in the world, and who can now make requests for the materials of the archives and arrive in Columbia to view them on site. My colleague, Evian Pan, Chinese processing archivist, will report the highlights of the center's groundbreaking achievements and inspirational legacies through her work on processing the center's collection. Evian.
Hello, everyone. Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Evian Pan, and I'm the Chinese processing archivist at the CV Star East Asian Library. And of course, I also don't have many touching stories and narratives, but I hope you still find my short talk interesting. So I will give you a very quick introduction to my very first project here at Columbia, which is to process the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange records. So to quickly reiterate what Susan and Jim have spoken about, the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange is a nonprofit organization affiliated with and headquartered here at Columbia University. It was established on October 1st, 1978 by Dr. Chou, and for 40 years, it was the only privately funded nonprofit organization that has been carrying out systematic exchanges in the arts between the US and China and beyond. Between its establishment in 1978 and its final closure in 2018, the center has hosted a vast array of projects that engaged with various creative genres from music, film, theater, dance, writing, and then furthermore, as Susan have spoken about, into arts education as well as cultural development. So the archive, therefore, will serve as an important hub of material evidence that showcases how much work that was involved to plan and coordinate and to carry out the spectrum of programs. So the timeline from donation to making available the center archive spans roughly close to 5 years. The bulk of the archive arrived at STAR in 2018 and 2019. Between September 2019 and March 2020, it was Yingwen Huang, who is an archivist at our Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, who started processing this collection. And in March 2020, as everything else, the project was put on hold due to the pandemic. And then in December of the same year, additional materials came to our hands. So all of the remaining materials were processed by me between October and December 2022. And then this past January, I was able to do a final round of quality control as well as drafting and publishing the finding aid. So the collection, after all the rearrangement and rehousing and preservation measures, the collection comes down to 114 linear feet on archival terms, and that is 67 record cartons, 27 manuscript boxes, 24 non-standard containers, which are flat album boxes, audiovisual containers, as well as boxes for oversized items. So all of the containers are barcoded and have been transported to our library's offsite storage facility, in fact, just yesterday. And all of the materials can be requestable box by box to be caught back on site if we have researchers request them. So the materials in this archive date between as early as 1956 to 2019. The bulk dates are 1977 and 2003, and the bulk dates reflect roughly the time span of of when the center programs were intensively carried out. So the finding aid to this collection is now available on the Columbia University Library's website. The finding aid, which is a standard form of description for an archival collection, serves as a guide that gives you information on the background, the contents, and how to access an archival collection. So all the collection level description, in this case, means an abstract, a scope of content, historical and biographical notes, have been written bilingually in English and Chinese. And that has become a standard practice here at Star Library for at least all of the Chinese language materials. So for the center archive, the bulk of the records was described at the folder level, meaning a short descriptive folder title and a year date range. A small portion of the materials were described at the item level, and that is for all the audiovisual materials, photo albums, and printed matter. So the folder level descriptions are displayed like this in a finding aid. The descriptions follow a hierarchical order from series to subseries to folders and sometimes to item. And the finding aid is directly linked to our library reference appointment system. So when a researcher wants to come in, he or she can submit the request directly from the finding aid. So the center collection is arranged into 11 series by subject matter or by material format, from photographs, printed materials, to project publicity files, correspondence, and then lastly to audiovisual records. And this kind of arrangement generally follows the original grouping and order of files when they came to our hands, and I believe they generally follow the original order of how the filing was done by the center staff. And in this project, only really a small portion of rearrangement interfiling was required, and that's all credit goes to the center staff. So as the archive is vast, and every single item, every photograph, every piece of paper that you can pull out from a box can give you a different story. Here, I'm just gonna give you a very quick rundown of what you might be able to see if you are visiting this collection. So the first series is photographs, and we have photographs in different formats, 35 millimeter slides, negatives, contact sheets, and prints of different sizes. And all of them have been rehoused using acid-free photo sleeves, mylar folders, or archival paper envelopes. And original envelopes and sometimes notes and ephemera were also kept together with the photos, as they always give you additional information. Close to a quarter of the first series is photographs taken during the Yunnan project. And they just show you how much the various trips and meetings and conferences that the center staff has taken. In addition to all of the Yunnan photos collected by the center, we have also received another donation from Paul Smith, who is the Director Emeritus of American Craft Museum and who was also a participant in the Yunnan project. And his donation photographs will be processed in the near future and will be cross-referenced in the finding aids with our center materials. More photographs in the form of albums, and they are preserved a little differently, housed flat in album boxes. The largest set of arrangement in this collection is the 4th series, which is Projects and Delegations. It contains all project-related files produced during Center's time span of operations. It's organized chronologically by project, and the materials you'll find correspondence, meeting notes, itineraries, reports, and etc. The 7th series is publicity. It includes articles, newspaper clippings, programs, and you'll find them often both in English and Chinese. The publishing sources range from university news platforms. Here we have Columbia University Record, to local and regional newspapers, to magazines and journals, and sometimes to internationally known sources. For all of the newspaper clippings in this series, as well as others, we have added interleaf paper to give them extra protection, as newspaper clippings can turn yellow and turn crisp easily. So if I can pull out one item or one set of items that represent this archive, it might be this very first item in the publicity series, which is the initial PR materials on the center's establishment. On the left here, we have the very first, the original press release, as well as the, in the back, front page news piece on the Columbia Spectator. And they're dated respectively on October 1st and 2nd in 1978. Moving on, I would like to acknowledge the various materials related to the Pacific Music Festival. I believe some of you might be interested. And so all of the Pacific music related files are cataloged, are arranged into our projects and delegations series, but then we also have a separate series 9, which houses all the music scores and portfolios submitted to the festival. And I suspect that some of your works submitted in 1990 are included in there. And the corresponding audio cassettes are described in the very last series, audiovisual materials. The scores and the cassettes are arranged by applicant country and then alphabetically by last name within each of their series. So very lastly, also in the audiovisual records, we have dozens of videotapes, mostly from the Yunnan project. They are recordings of different trips and seminars and conferences. And in the future, should staffing and funding be available, we are also seeking to digitize these materials so they can be more accessible to a wider group of researchers. So it's been such an honor to take on this project. It's been truly a very inspiring experience to work through the center's archival materials, especially for me, not only as an archivist, but also a former art historian, anthropologist in training. And so if you have any questions and if you would like to see some of the materials in the archive, you're welcome to get in touch with our library. And thank you very much.
Everyone. My name is Lei Liang. I'm here to speak as the director of a center named after Professor Chou in Guangzhou, China. And before I speak, I will welcome you to see a video message by the president of Xinhai Conservatory in Guangzhou.
各位嘉宾朋友们，大家好，我是广州星海音乐学院院长蔡乔忠，同时也担任周文中音乐研究中心学术委员会的副主席。非常荣幸有机会通过视频的方式与大家见面。周文中先生是我们非常敬仰的作曲家、 教育家，是20世纪世界音乐发展的见证者和音乐创作的参与者，也是推动中美音乐交流的文化使者。2016年11月，我和几位同事有幸与周先生在他纽约的家中深入交谈。周先生语重心长地与我们畅谈了多元文化的音乐思想，也非常动情地谈及他在中西文化间跨越的人生感悟。在2次非常愉快的交谈后，周先生同意将他的毕生的藏书无偿捐赠给星海音乐学院。2018年，星海音乐学院专门建造了周文中藏书馆，成立了周文中音乐研究中心，组织了周文中音乐研究中心学术委员会，聘请梁雷教授等15位专家担任学术委员会委员。2018年11月，星海音乐学院举办了周文中音乐研究中心成立大会暨周文中国际音乐学术研讨会，在学术界引起巨大的反响。周先生非常满意，我们也备受鼓舞。很遗憾，1年后，周先生以96岁高龄在家中仙逝。此后，周先生的家人决定将他收藏的其他的乐器的文物和使用的斯坦威三角钢琴全部捐赠给星海音乐学院，这是我们星海音乐学院的荣幸。我们也将继承周先生的精神遗产，传承传播周先生学术思想及音乐教育理念。今年正值周文中先生100岁诞辰之际，星海音乐学院也将于11月举办第2届周文中国际音乐学术研讨会。在此，也向各位发出诚挚的邀请，欢迎大家到中国广州共襄盛事。最后，预祝周文中100年纪念与庆祝活动圆满成功。
Thank you. That was President Tsai. And I'm very honored to be here. First of all, I feel that many of you have incredible stories to share. I look forward to be on the receiving end of those words. Just a word about how I met Professor Chou. I came to America in 1990, and he was already a beacon for Chinese composers like myself, but I waited. I didn't want to just meet him because I felt, what would I bring to him to not waste his time, other than taking a photo with him. So I waited for many years, even though my uncle, Wen Tsai, was Professor Chou's very, very dear friend for many years, just in fact, as neighbors. And I know my cousin Lun Yi is here. Many, many years of decades of friendship with this incredible neighbor. But I was staying with the Tsai family, but I just didn't have the courage to meet with Professor Chou. I wanted to study his music. I wanted to read his books. There are plenty of interesting things for me to study. Until 15 years later, I decided, yes, I'm finishing my PhD. I'm ready to meet him. And that was my first meeting, introduced by my auntie, Auntie Pei Di. So the first project we did was with Professor Luo Qin, who unfortunately can't be here today, but I'm pretty sure he's on Zoom. He and I took 2 years to make available 50 years of writing by Professor Chou into Chinese. And the book was published in 2013, and that has become a major publication in China. And you can imagine the impact that has on the young people in China. And as I joined Lu Yan and Su Min and Susan, Michelle, and the indispensable Belinda in preparing this, many times we face questions that we didn't have an easy answer for. And these questions can be quite difficult sometimes, and sometimes they're silly questions. And I overheard Su Min and Lu Yan said, "What would Dad do?" that was a kind of a magic phrase because he kind of solved a lot of problems. Like, what would I wear today? I wasn't sure if I should put on a tie. And it was in that moment then Louis and Suming assured me that, no, Dad wouldn't want you to look like a banker. So I decided not to put on a tie. But you can see this is the kind of question that has become kind of a magic phrase for us. I certainly have asked that questions many times. What would Professor do? Well, Professor Chou, what would he choose to do? When Professor Chou himself generously donated 3,000 items, including those books and his collections to Xinghai Conservatory, we had the opportunity to build a library. And with President Tsai, we were thinking, what would Professor Chou do in this space? You know, with his books, his gaze is right on the walls. He's going to look at everyone in this space and the family's piano later on. What would you do? What would he want to do? Well, we wouldn't just want to make it into a reading room. This should be a sanctuary. In Chinese, I would call it Jingtu, Pure Land. I think China really needs that, a place where people can really cultivate their sense of tradition, understanding where they came from, what to study, exchange ideas freely. So in the center of that room are not library shelf, but in fact a beautiful round table, designed in traditional Chinese style, but it's a place for people to sit around and have conversations. So I really hope that sometime you can go visit that space. It's a beautiful place, not only for discussion, seminars, but also for rehearsals, workshop, all of that. And I think that's what Professor Chou would like to see. And the beautiful ceremony in 2018, I can't believe it's not long ago, the Brentano Quartet came and they brought down the house with the performance of Professor Chou's String Quartet. That was the first time the Chinese audience could hear that. It was incredibly moving, and over 100 guests from around China and around the world joined. It was really, really powerful. And I will try to be short. I'll just tell you what we have done ever since. Since we opened the center, we have seen 20 publications, analysis of Professor Chou's works, all published in the leading journals in China, written by important scholars like Professor Nanji Rao here in the audience and many others. Professor Shiji Panchu, one of Professor Chou's most dedicated students, recorded an invaluable collection of 10-hour set of Professor Chou's oral history that was also published by Shanghai Conservatory Press. We opened the Chou Wen-chung Distinguished Lecture Series in Guangzhou, and that, of course, happened right around the time of the pandemic, but we're able to do it on Zoom. We have about regularly 400 to 500 people joining us for every lecture. And that really kind of was like a lifeline for the conservatory there, that they could have these conversations, not confined to what is going on campus, but in fact have dialogue with people outside and truly discuss important things, you know. So I thought that was just a beautiful platform that Professor Chou offered. There's a online platform after Professor Chou, and we have published, as of now, the complete program notes that Professor Chou authored himself, translated into Chinese, of course, by our wonderful team. And we have started publishing articles by younger generation of composers and theorists and musicologists. So now we have about 3,000 subscribers to that list. So you can see that it's really happening in a way that might surprise you. The future of our center, we are thinking of establishing, perhaps next year, the Chou Wen-chung International Composition Commission Award, because we know that this is one of those conversations that many of you had with Professor Chou, that his passion is to support younger composers, younger artists. So we want to be sure this is aligned with his vision, and hopefully we can create a commission that will support 6 to 8 awards every year. And he always spoke so gratefully about the support he received when he was here as a student, and and those things that kind of help him to put him on the map, the kind of project. And he wanted to be sure younger generations of composers will have that opportunity like he did. I work very closely again with Professor Luo Jin of Shanghai Conservatory and Nancy again, Nancy Rao, and also Peter's edition. I know Jean is sitting in the back, and Soccer Foundation and Library of Congress in preparing to publish 2 sets of his manuscripts, and they're beautiful. I mean, if you have seen Beethoven's manuscript, Wagner's manuscript, and then you come to Chou Wen-chung. This is a calligrapher, literally a calligrapher, and they are beautiful. And we are hoping to have this published this year, along with beautiful essays and an incredible recording made by my dear colleague Professor Stephen Schick in the audience, using the original instruments that Professor Chou composed for and donated to UC San Diego. And the idea again is, we asked this question: what would Professor Chou do with these instruments? You can donate it and lock it away as kind of a museum piece and something that is a revered object. But no, let's make sure that younger composers, performers have access to them and continue to compose for them, be inspired by them, play on them, record using them, and all of that. So we just did that last week, I believe. So yes, we have, with Steve again, we have established an annual commission named by Professor Chou for music inspired by this set of instruments. So we're now talking about the 3rd commission already. Well, the backdrop of today's U.S. and China's relationship is spiraling downhill, and the tensions rising. And I also asked, what would Professor Chou do? And I think you would agree with me that he would choose to bridge the chasm and to promote and nurture mutual understanding through cultural exchange. And it seems that arts and cultural exchange seem to be needed more than ever right now. And I'm very, very grateful that the China Center at UC San Diego, its director, Susan Shirk, who was the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and the Executive Director, Guang Lei, we partnered together to create the Chou Wen-chung Distinguished Lecturer, a lecture series at UC San Diego, and this is our 2nd year to promote cultural exchange on the platform that is usually focused on discussing politics. And I think that might be the kind of things that Professor Chou would like to see today. Okay, so I would like to just go on a little bit about what does that mean. What would Professor Chou do when I ask that question to me as an artist? I think Professor Chou would choose to avoid shortcuts. I think he would choose not to commodify his work. I think Professor Chou would choose not to draw attention to himself. And I think he would avoid political expediency. He would choose not to exoticize his music. I remember the story in the 50s when one of the most famous music critics came to him and asked him to consider why not throw a gong on the floor. That kind of things would certainly catch the attention of the audience and critics. And he found that to be very insulting. And he called out in his writing the current American thirst for commodifying any conceivable or imaginable merchandise, as well as the Chinese vogue. And he's always criticizing this side, and then he goes on to criticize the other side, as well as the Chinese vogue for emulating everything. And he warned against the impulse to fulfill momentary needs of the commercially driven musical enterprises. And as Wenren, as you know, Wenren is a man of the arts in traditional China. Wenren was an artist who was upheld as the heart of the society and considered the conscience of humanity. And I asked myself, what would Professor Chou do as a Wenren? I think he would choose to be independent. Independent of all labels, even though labeling himself would have been much easier, would have been much more convenient. We know Professor Chou would not choose such an easy path, and this is what he wrote, an essay from 1993. He said, independent is the key word. Independent of Western cultures. Independence of one's own culture. I always find that to be extremely revealing of his thinking. Independent of conventions and free from social, political, and professional pressures. It takes courage. Artists are the true warriors of humanity. Today, this is in Professor Chou's voice, today I still prefer to be old-fashioned and to think of artists as the conscience of humanity. In this light, how can a composer's task be easy? And I know many artists here and also online would align with that and understand what he meant. He was not someone who would choose the easy path. And I think the question that has become a little magic phrase for me, what would Professor Chou do, is something that might serve as a beacon for generations of artists who aspire to follow his footsteps. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Mark Steinberg. I'm a member of the Brentano Quartet. We loved Professor Chou very much, and it was an incredible honor and privilege for us and a great joy for us to be part of the birth of his two great string quartets. And we're so grateful to him for writing them. We're grateful on behalf of the institution of the string quartet that he wrote these two marvelous pieces that really explore his ideas through the medium of what we love to do. My introduction to him came when we were approached with the idea of perhaps playing his first quartet, which was yet to be written. And I got to listen to a lot of his music, which I loved, and we agreed that we would be very excited to be part of this project. He listened to some recordings of us playing, and the first time I got to talk to him was in a phone call, which lasted for about 45 minutes. And he was very generous in that phone call, and it was, I will always remember it, because he found it very important to share with me some of his outlook on art, on music, on what it meant to him. And I could tell that it was very important to him that I understand something of how he would approach thinking about writing for a quartet. He spoke about his philosophy of music. He spoke about yin and yang, about nature, about calligraphy, about the music for the chin. And I got the sense that for him, music was a kind of investigation, a way to unearth truths about life and about the world and about how we all are together. While he was writing the piece, I got to go visit him in his wonderful home in Sullivan Street. And I remember going up to his studio, which was, of course, so beautifully decorated and such a wonderful contemplative space. And sitting there in the room with him were a violin, a viola, and a cello. And I found that very, very touching. It was as if those instruments were members of his family, and he would sit in the room and wait for them to speak to him and let him know how they wanted to sing through him. He was always incredibly generous to us as a quartet in being part of the creation of these works. And we discussed many details with him, of course, and even were part of some small changes. I remember vividly in the first quartet talking with him about a sound he had in mind that was evoking certain traditional instruments from China, which were pizzicato, plucking the strings of the instruments. And we weren't finding quite the sound that he wanted, which had a certain hardness. And eventually we asked him what would he think about using guitar picks on our instruments, and we tried it out, and he loved that idea, and that's now part of the piece. Also, the last movement of that piece, that was the first quartet is a piece we played many, many, many times, over and over. And over the course of many performances, I started to have a sense in the last movement that there was a moment when it always felt to me like it should go straight to the last part of the piece, but there was intervening material in there. So I just thought about it, and we played it again and again, and eventually I brought it up with my colleagues, and it turned out that other people had the same thought. So I screwed up my courage, and with extreme trepidation, called up Professor Chou and mentioned to him this feeling. And I said, I know it's your piece, and I just want to tell you that this is what we're feeling. And he said to me, which I found quite amazing, he said, you've played this piece so many times. At this point, I think maybe you know it better than I do. I'm going to think about what you said, and I'll get back to you. And in the end, he did make an alteration which slightly changed the shape of the last movement. And I thought that was a really beautiful instance of putting the idea before the ego, which of course is very much who he was. After the first quartet, my quartet had a project where we asked a number of composers to write pieces that would be in dialogue with Bach, specifically fugues from Bach's Art of Fugue. And he very graciously agreed to be part of this project. And he told me at that point that when he was a student of Martineau as a young man, he had brought in a fugue that he wrote in a pentatonic style, and that Martineau had looked at this piece and looked at him and just uttered one word. He looked at him and said, "Why?" And Professor Chou told me that this movement that he wrote as part of our Bach project was his answer to that question 50 years later. And that he had been musing over this for all the intervening decades, which I find extremely beautiful and touching, that he was always in quest of the idea of a great truth. And he was willing to dedicate himself to looking for that for his entire life, really. That piece then became the first movement of the second quartet, which he presented to us. And we were, again, very honored to have that piece. I think he taught us something about the string quartet as a medium. And he used it in a very particular way. He made the quartet, again, a living creature, and showed us something about how it could be a coexistence of independent lines that are free and flowing voices that somehow intertwine to make something even greater than the sum of its parts. I have here a letter from Professor Chou, typewritten from the 90s, concerning his first quartet. It starts out by saying, "Since you seem to think what I had to say about imagery is helpful, I thought it might be good for me to point out as much as practical at this time. So he talks quite a lot about various nature images, different modes, how he put the piece together. I won't read it all now, but I will read something he writes about, a short slow section near the end of the first quartet. He says, "The lento section should be highly meditative. But what is that? I don't really know. Think of the kind of stillness in nature that you have ever experienced personally. This is already anticipated earlier, as you know. It should be played with as much patience and thoughtfulness as we still can bring ourselves to in this more and more technological world." This was written in the 1990s, of course. He goes on from there, but the letter closes by him saying, "I have no idea whether the above will help you at all. At least I hope I do not bore you." And I will say that it seemed to me he could do almost an endless number of things, but I'm not sure he was capable of boring people. So we're very pleased to have the opportunity this evening to share with you the second movement of the second string quartet, a very beautiful, touching, and moving elegy.
thank you all for coming. Everyone must know about my father's love for percussion and gongs in general. This particular gong, if people ever visited my dad in his music studio, was sitting right by that door. And it was a gong collection that Perez and my father shared, and they actually, shared their gongs. We found a set of notes about the sonic qualities of each of the gongs. Unfortunately, we don't know which note he appended to which gong, but this is very meaningful for my dad to have the gongs in his music studio. And one of the things that we thought was such a great connection was his relationship to Perez with these gongs. When my mom passed away as well, my father also hit a gong to remember her. And there's something really incredible about feeling the vibrations, the music vibrations, and feeling it sort of go away. So we'd like to honor Dad in the same spirit, and to connect my father with the younger generation. I remember when he was just maybe 1 or 2 years old, in the music studio, hitting the gongs and so on, and my dad would just have the biggest smile on his face. So I think, we just want to leave with those kind of memories of my father and handing it over to the younger generation. So we're going to have Espen strike the gong 3 times. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you, everybody. Good job, Espen.